Now I would like to move over to the book, and if you click on this link, reading chapter 2, it will take you to a login page, and that login page will allow you to access the textbook online. Now, sometimes there can be some issues with too many people trying to access it, so I wanted to just step through a little bit about the textbook right here. So we've set the stage for the emergence of rock and roll in the 1950s. What was happening right before that point? In 1950, we had the crooner music, we still had big band, we had rhythm and blues, we had country music going, and even down here, we still had some folk and blues music out in the very rural parts of America. In the late 1940s, we were recovering from World War II. Many of the men that were in the military were coming home, and America was changing rapidly. The economy was booming after the war, A, because so much industry had been developed in the war, and B, because the government was investing in veterans through things such as the GI Bill, where they were providing money for middle-class Americans. This increased the amount of disposable income available to people, and for the first time, record companies started to say, hey, maybe we can start to have younger people listening and paying for music. And you'll see here some ideas, like the idea of younger people getting an allowance emerged for the first time. Before 1920, young people had to work. Now they actually could go to school, and while they were doing that, their parents could provide them some money that allowed them to purchase music. As I had said earlier, many of the records that were being sold in the 1940s were the Crooner Records, and these were the sort of romantic, slow-moving, sweet-voiced songs a lot of women had started listening to during the war. This crooner music was so popular that it had actually supplanted much of the big band music that had been happening the years before. The idea of easy listening in music came out during those times in the 40s. Okay? I talked previously about the GI Bill and how that was allowing Americans to have more disposable income than they'd had before. Radio, which had been created in the 1920s, was really giving an opportunity to record companies and the music business to control and manage access to music and what people liked and didn't like. We're going to continue that idea that we'll have something new coming in. In traditional America, it had been something rural or something associated with African Americans that came into white popular urban culture. By the early 1950s, we get the idea of a DJ playing songs and the idea of having charts with the most popular songs. This eventually led to the idea of payola, in which the record companies would actually pay certain DJs to play their songs. This became illegal eventually because it was seen as a conflict of interest where the record companies were actually controlling what people could listen to. Payola is an important term for you to know. As I talked about earlier, the idea of there being these different types of music. You had the popular crooner music, then you had the race music that was played mainly for African Americans in the cities, and then you had this idea of hillbilly music played for rural white Americans. These terms eventually changed into rhythm and blues and country. When Tin Pan Alley was initially formed, there was no recorded music. It was all paper. What happened, though, was by the 1920s and 1930s, when we can start to have recorded music, whether it's on the radio or played on things like jukeboxes, you have to have a way to pay the artists from that original recording or song. And the idea was they developed an organization called ASCAP in the 1910s, and ASCAP's job was to go and monitor establishments and broadcasters and make sure that they were actually paying back to the artists and the songwriters and the publishers money. If you ever hear the term ASCAP or BMI, these are some of the organizations whose job is to make sure that artists are getting paid from the music that's played. The 1940s really gave rise to the idea of the recording industry with the invention of the tape recorder, which allowed musicians to record a song and then re-record, which we call overdubbing, okay, right here, which allows you to create a performance that wasn't like the original performance, is actually better than the original performance. The person most responsible for launching the recording industry in the United States is Bing Crosby. He began to record all of his shows on radio ahead of time and then have them played back at night when he was at home having dinner with his family. There was no way to send these actual tape recordings to people at the time, so they would be recorded in the studio on tape. Then they were sold to the general public as discs, and these discs could hold about 3 to 4 minutes of music. This gave birth to the idea of the 3-minute long song, and it still is. If you listen to songs today in the classes that I teach on songwriting, we are shooting for a good song that lasts about 3 minutes. Another important emergence that was happening was the idea of FM radio, and FM radio started in 1940. We're going to see the biggest influence of FM radio in the 1960s. It'll take a few years to get there, but the idea that we could send music in stereo, meaning there's a different left and right channel, began to emerge in the 1940s. And FM radio had much better sound quality than AM. The most important development right before rock and roll came out was the idea of the television. Now, rock and roll will learn how to use TV in the form of Elvis to become more popular than ever. But when it first came out, television had a tremendous impact on the music industry. More people were buying TVs and watching television than they were buying radios and watching radio. As I talked about before, the crooners were the dominant popular music form. Some of the names of the most popular crooners are here. You'll probably recognize a lot of them. You probably hear a lot of them at Christmas time. It's when a lot of that Christmas music was recorded. And these crooners would start to do covered versions of more of the rural music, some of the folk and the blues and country music. And the idea of the musical star began to be born during this time period. These singers that would sing in front of the usually often big bands, these crooners then became popular in their own name, and that's why we know these names so well here. Frank Sinatra is one of the more important ones, as well as Bing Crosby. You can see here some of the ideas that their fans are going crazy about them. Nat King Cole is another very important artist during that time, another important crooner. And then we'll turn slightly to the idea of the Woody Guthrie. Then we'll return to the idea of Woody Guthrie and the idea of folk music coming in with a social bent to it. In fact, Pete Seeger and the Weavers that he sung with became accused of being communists because they were starting to question some of the social and government policies that we were using here. And as I said earlier, this is going to help contribute to rock and roll, especially in the 1960s. You'll see here some of the discussion in the book about the Weavers and how they became blacklisted. Rhythm and blues began to have its own charts. Similar to the way the DJs had charts for big band and popular music, they also began to have charts for rhythm and blues, and you'll see Billboard becomes one of the names back then, the Billboard charts. And as African Americans and people from the South want to distance themselves from their rural roots, they began to identify more with things like rhythm and blues or country music, less with race music and hillbilly music. You'll see that country music and rhythm and blues began to take up more and more time on radio programming. There's even the influence of ragtime and the bouncy swing music from jazz in this rhythm and blues sound, and gave rise to the idea of jump blues. And jump blues became sort of the party music of the 1940s, in contrast to the more smooth, romantic crooner singing. Louis Jordan's band was one of the first bands to become popular with both white and African American listeners. One important artist that I do not have on our list of artists is Muddy Waters, and he was a blues guitarist from the South that became discovered and became more popular in the rhythm and blues circuit. But one of the things he started doing was using the electric guitar, which came out in the 1930s, and the idea of turning up the guitar so loud that it would overload the amplifier and the system would create this idea of feedback, and the feedback gave a dirtier sound that is also more sustained, meaning the guitar, instead of being kind of percussive in a short sounding note, each note would last a long time, which allowed the artist to play more melodic sounds on the guitar, and the idea of that lead guitar is becoming born. His topics also started to cover things like sex and being very mannish and that sort of thing, and we're going to hear a lot more of that influence in rock and roll as well. Hoochie Coochie Man is an example of one of those songs. Country music continued to be important as a precursor to rock and roll. There was a very famous radio show called the Grand Ole Opry that still runs out of Nashville today. I think it's been going for 100 years or so. And country music began to really be popular in bars and what are called honky-tonks in rural America. And this is where that many of the performers would first be noticed, similar to the dancing establishments that rhythm and blues singers were playing in. Country music musicians were playing in these honky-tonks and bars. And the music began to be catered towards the people who were in honky-tonks. Male-female relationships, alcohol, that sort of thing. Day-to-day life. Very different than some of the music we'll hear in rock and roll, actually, in terms of its content. Hank Williams was the most important honky-tonk artist or country music artist at the time, and he died at a very young age, but produced several songs that included #1 hits. But he gave rise to the idea of rockabilly. And rockabilly is country music that is played on modern instruments, such as drum set, electric guitar, electric bass, and starts to be a precursor to rock and roll. Okay, those are all the most important points from the book on rock and roll. I've tried to tie it in with this diagram I've drawn of the development of the different genres and artists before rock and roll. You should be familiar with this list of artists and the songs in yellow in preparation for the quiz and other activities.